Welcome to the Holding All the Cards podcast. My name is Daniel. I go by Kiramode on the forums, and today I'm going to do a deck spotlight on one of my absolute favorite decks ever. I feel like this deck's about as close to complete as it's going to get, so now the timing is right to do this. So in the past, I'd say a couple weeks or so, I've been testing this deck with the inclusion of Zeb's Pod, the Last Warrior. Now, there's been different incarnations of this deck. The first version of this deck was simply Falcon, Cracken, Yoda, and then Owen when you could do Owen Falcon. But then once they nerfed that combo, I kind of scrapped the deck. Then in March, Feigning Captivity got revealed, and then I almost shit bricks because I thought there's so much potential here to bring this deck back. The only problem was at the time Zeb didn't exist. So if I wanted to play this triplet with Yoda, I had to get creative. I either had to accept that I would just not get Yoda very often, or I would have to find ways around it. So what I ended up doing is the first version of this deck had no Zebs, and it had one Gamble run and one Wolfman. But the problem was I never wanted to play the Wolfman's objective, so I swapped out the Wolfman for Owen because Owen gives you an objective you actually want to play, so you're able to up your percentage that you'll have Jedi resources up to 83%, and then you also have Owen just in case for mana fixing. But there was an awkward problem with that deck, which it wasn't that you had 5 yellow resources that you can more or less work with. It was that if you only have 5 yellows, that means that you're probably not going to be able to hit 2 yellow resources very often, which is kind of a problem. The other problem is that Gamble Run and the Land Speeder, or Luke's Land Speeder, they're both vehicles, so you can't bring them in with the Falcon. And the Falcon's kind of what drives this deck. So when I saw Zeb's Pod, I was actually expecting Zeb to be good because Sabine could potentially work in this spot, but she had other problems with her pod that I didn't like. But my thought was, if they continue the mana fixing theme with the Spectres, Zeb's Pod, when he gets released, will be great. So I was just speculating for like a while, just thinking, okay, when Zeb shows up, like that's going to be the guy. And sure enough, Zeb showed up, and I have mixed feelings about this deck. But let me start off by talking about what makes this deck good. The best thing about this deck is that you can play to save a friend, which in my opinion is the best mission in either light side or dark side. And the reason is, when you play to save a friend, you get the benefit immediately. It doesn't cost you any resources since it's a free mission. So by playing it, you get the extra engagement. A lot of decks just want to be able to make 4 attacks. So by being able to get the 4th attack in without having to pay resources is huge. Like you can play this turn 1 without like hurting your tempo. But more importantly, to save a friend lets you get any unit. So you can just search your deck, get 2 Falcons captured underneath it, and then rescue mission it out. This right here, I think, is close to the strongest opening you can have in this game for light side. I think the best opening you can have on light side would be Owen plus 2 Jedi mains. So like a Owen into Luke into Yoda, or like Owen and gives you like Ahsoka and Luke, or Ahsoka and Yoda, or something. Like that's probably your best opening. But I can make a good case that if you have the Falcon and any big guy in your hand, so either a Cracken, a Tantil Screech, a Zeb, or a Yoda, you have Falcon, any one of these 4 in your hand, and then just anything else that's worth 2 mana, right? So maybe you get a resource, right? This costs 1 mana net. Maybe you have a bow rifle. Maybe you have a bamboozle. Maybe if you're really lucky, you get the nuts and you have a Yoda, you seek Yoda. Maybe you play one of these infiltration specialists. Something like that, right? Like if you can get to save a friend, rescue mission, anything that can fit within that 2 mana, and then any big dude, that's probably your best or argue like close to the best possible opening you can have on light side, and that brings a lot of potential. The other thing too is you don't need this combo turn 1. You just need the hits to save a friend before you hit rescue mission. So as long as you hit to save a friend within the first 2 turns, you can let it sit there, and eventually you'll draw into rescue mission, which means you'll get a Falcon, and a 2-cost Falcon is just mean, especially because you can play a 2-cost Falcon during conflict. So that way, people can't blank your Falcon with Tarkin, right? You just wait until conflict starts, then get the Falcon into play and send him in. Now, the other nice thing about this deck is because you have May the Force, you can always commit stuff. So even if you can't bring in a guy that's worth the Falcon, you can always commit the Falcon. Committing Yoda's okay, and committing Tamptail's okay. I actually don't mind committing Cracken just because you pull a token off of him. So typically you're only going to get 1 to 2 shots with Cracken in a game anyways. So if you can attack once, he does his thing, and then you commit him just to make sure that they don't counterattack and then focus him down. And he has a black tactics for defense, which is always nice. Zeb's really the only guy that you can't commit, which is unfortunate, but still workable. Now, I'm sure the question that a lot of people have when they see this deck is, why do you need Yoda, right? And the obvious answer is, it's just the best pod in the game. Why wouldn't you include it? But there's more reasons than it just being the best pod that it's in this deck that I need. So the first reason that I want Yoda in the deck is he's just too cost efficient, right? Like at 3 mana, what you get with Yoda is too much. But more importantly, you also get Yoda, you seek Yoda, which this deck at its core is a tempo deck, right? Like you have stuff like undercosted Falcons. You have the Cracken who breaks dudes out. You have Tamsil Screech, who he's really a 4-cost unit that's masquerading as a 3-drop unit because he has this text, but his text is almost always active. So he's always undervalued as for what he does. So when you want to be ramping up, and then also it should be noted, that has a resource, that has a resource, that has a resource, and that has a resource. You have 6 limited resources that don't cost you any tempo to play, and you have 1 2-for-1 resource that's not limited. So you can also build your resource base pretty quickly with this deck. And that's what this deck wants to do, right? You want to pump out guys, you want to get your resources down, and you want to shit out tactics on your opponent's board. And Yoda helps you do that by a lot, because you have a 2-cost unit, or you have a unit that's worth at least 4, maybe 5 mana for what he does, but you can get him in for 2, and you can get him in action speed. So this goes back to playing guys at the right time, right? You can avoid someone's tactics and then play Yoda, or avoid someone's tactics and then play rescue mission to go get the Falcon or whoever else might be captured. It allows you to work around people's tactics. Maybe if they have better edge hands than you, you can still maneuver around what it is that they're trying to do. Also, Yoda gives you a Seed to Decay. So having the undercosted event to help you with your ramping with what the deck's trying to do, having a Seeds to be able to let you auto strike in some cases, and also having a 5-pip card. Like, not only is Yoda just a great unit, he's also a 5-pipper. So if you really need to win an edge battle, he helps you a lot, and he becomes especially dirty if you undercover him back in. So one of the problems with Yoda is you play him turn 1 either via direct play or you seek Yoda him. Then either on that first turn or on the second turn, you edge your second Yoda. And then they kill your current Yoda at some point. So you have one Yoda's dead, the other Yoda got discarded and edge, and then you draw into Yoda, you seek Yoda. What do? The answer is you undercover the other Yoda, get him back in. Now this isn't a dead card anymore. Moreover, just throwing an extra 5-pip card in your deck, like if you have undercover, if you want, that means you can have 4 to 5 Yodas in your deck that you can just be using either to fetch out with Yoda, you seek Yoda, or to use them as edge cards. It's just, it allows you to disguise how many pips you have because you can shuffle this fool back in. And you can also shuffle Twist back in. So if your opponent has a kind of flimsy edge deck, the last thing they want to see is you use Undercover to get these 2 cards back in your deck. It's just kind of mean to be able to do that to somebody. So that's why you need him. And ideally, I would find another pod to replace him just because of the resource issues. But the reality is he's just too good. The edge is too high. The cost of the cards are too low, and he fits so much with what I'm trying to do with everything else that it doesn't really make sense to want to take him out. Now, Zeb's pod, this is the real key pod, right? Because this deck, I've been running this for a little while. These 8 pods here, plus, you know, a rotating cast in these last 2 slots, that's been a deck that I've been working with for a little while now. So what does Zeb's pod bring to the table? The best card he has, by far, is the bow rifle. This allows you to get surprise kills. In particular, these are dudes no one ever wants to block, because usually you'll have cards captured that you might want to get back. Like you might have a Seeds captured, or you'll have a Rescue Mission captured, you'll have a Yoda Yoda captured, or some other card that your opponent doesn't want you getting back in your hand. It's customary when I attack with these fools that nobody block them, right? No one wants to get in these guys' way, but I can attack in edge, discard a bow rifle. Once you strap a bow rifle to these dudes, now they turn into Y-Wings. And then they deal 2 damage instead of 1 damage, which makes it so now they become must-kill targets, and once you kill them, I can go get that capture card back in my hand, whatever it is. So it lets you do that. It makes it so Tamtil Screech is also becomes terrifying, because when Tamtil Screech is a bow rifle, if this dude swings, he's swinging for 3 damage on blast, but then he also has 2 guns. He still has his tactics. And then a Tamtil with a bow rifle and a bamboozle, that's one of those game-winning combos that can end games really, really fast, faster than opponents expect. So there's some good stuff there. So bow rifle's good. The Slicer's mediocre in this deck. He's a really good card, and if you build around him, he's about as good as Kanan's objective. The problem is, in this deck, I don't have a ton of enhancements. I have 10 enhancements in this deck, so he's going to hit about 20% of the time, which it's fine, right? Like, if you get 2 opportunities to hit with this guy, you're going to hit often enough for him to be worth playing, but generally there's better cards that you could use, but for 2 mana, hey, you could do a lot worse. Well equipped is fine. I don't mind it. The best thing about well equipped is that if you have your improvised defenses on one of your objectives, it allows you to be able to pull a token off of it. So sometimes freeing up that extra resource will give you enough to be able to play your rescue mission. It'll give you enough to be able to play your bamboozle. Maybe it opens up enough space to let you play your bow rifle. And moves like that can sometimes be the difference between winning and losing. And then lastly, you have the main man himself, Zeb Aurelios. The sad thing about Zeb's pod is that Zeb's just not that good. So let's assume Zeb always had targeted strike. So let's say his text doesn't require you to have more enhancements, you just get targeted strike. The problem with Zeb is his reaction's never on when it matters. You know, like, if people are looking to avoid his reaction, they'll save a card back. And if they don't care for his reaction, like the difference between 1 damage and 2 damages and a difference, then they'll just let him strike. It's really, really rare that his reaction will help you in a sense, right? Like, it's just not going to happen. And then the conditional targeted strike's not fun. 4 costs is really too much for the icons he has here. Those are 3 cost icons, I think. So he's overcosted. Now, you don't mind playing him via the Falcon, right? So I'd much rather have Zeb in the deck than the Marauder or Luke's Landspeeder, because Zeb's just a character, so you can Falcon bounce him in. And he's actually a pretty good bamboozle candidate since his icons are both black. You can swing in. If they can't tap him down, he swings twice. You know, like, it's not like he's a terrible unit, but he's not a great unit either. And that's one of the things I noticed. So what you get with this pod here is you get consistency. You now have 4 brown objectives. So between your objectives, Falcon bouncing to play Yoda, and then rescuing Yoda out with the Cracken and or rescue mission, you have enough ways to get Yoda in there consistently, right? So not having a bunch of brown resources, because this is a Rebel affiliated deck, um, it doesn't kill you, right? Like you can always work around your situation with Yoda. So he increases consistency by virtue of having the influence card. He does have a resource. So unlike Sabine, who doesn't have a resource, because Sabine, her excuse for resources is just being herself, which isn't great, he actually has a resource. I prefer that these 3 pips would be like on the fake card as opposed to on the resource. But hey, you take what you can get. Um, but he has a resource, so it allows you to keep building up your ramp. You're not sacrificing your ability to get your resources on the table and build up a really strong base. You keep that going. You have a serviceable guy that you can bounce to the Falcon. You have a Chud that's not terrible. You have a good card that's actually worth playing the pod. And then you have another card that, again, just not a dead card. It has its uses. So when I think of Zeb, in this deck in particular, Zeb is definitely what I call a function pod. And so there's certain pods in the game that are exclusively function pods, and there's other pods that are function pods within certain decks. So I think the perfect example of a function pod is Council of the Sith. Council of the Sith, when you play Sith, you have big units like Vader and Palpatine. You need resources. So you have a pod that has 2 resources. It also has a twist, so you don't have to worry about getting that anywhere else. It has card draw to mitigate dead draws with Dark Precog. It builds up your edge hand, so even though the pod itself doesn't have great edge, its objective allowing you to draw a card makes up for that. And then the Kawadi security team and the advisor, they're not great, but they don't kill you. And that's the key, right? Like some decks, they have so many game-breaking cards, but they just don't function without a glue pod, right? They just need that pod to make it all come together. That's what Zeb's pod is here. He's definitely not the focus of the deck. You don't really ever want to draw into Zeb. You don't love playing any of his cards. They're more edge cards and they're more filler cards, but his pod allows this deck to function more consistently. So that's something I've been liking about having him in there. But it is kind of sad to hear the music on the fact that Zeb's just not that good. If you build a deck around Zeb, then he can put in work. Like if Han Solo's on the table and he has an extra gun, and you can have his targeted strike active almost always, he's a completely different unit. If you're playing a deck with more smuggler units, a bow rifle's a different unit. If you're playing the bow rifle with Han Solo, it's way better on Han than it is on like one of these little derps that I have or Lando. The slicer is way better if you can trigger him instead of being 20% like he is in this deck. If you can get the slicer up to say 30 or maybe even 40%, he becomes a whole nother level of unit. He goes from being the unit that you play if you have 2 extra mana in this deck to the unit that you want to play every single time. And then well equips one of those cards that it's like, in this deck, it's whatever. In other decks, it becomes a key part of what the deck's trying to do. So, when I look at this deck, I was really, really hoping that the Last Warrior would be like the missing piece to this deck, right? Because I've been working on this deck since I saw this pod previewed. I've been wanting to make this work. I've even tried it with Rumors at the Cantina for the mana fixing, but the units are just too terrible to justify it. I really want this deck to work, and it does work really well. And it was one of those decks that I was testing for Worlds, but there's little snags, right? Like the snag is that Zeb's pod's just not that good. And also there's no shielding in this deck, which is kind of problematic. But what this deck does have, and I think the best reason to play this deck, is that the upside of this deck's insane. Again, 2-cost Falcon, that can win you the game. If you can play Bamboozle 3 to 4 times per game by just undercovering it every chance you get, that can win you the game. The Falcon the Cracken being able to one-shot an objective and then busting someone out, that can win you the game. You can even sometimes win games by just having Yoda and Lando sit on the Force all day. Like, there's a lot of ways that this deck can win games, and this deck almost always has an out, right? It's very rare that you'd ever be in a situation where you have 0 chance of winning. Like, there's almost always something that this deck can do to pull games out of its ass. And that's what I liked about it, and that's why I was testing it. But I think the better version of this deck is going to come when we see what the next Spectre pod is, because we still haven't seen Hera and we still haven't seen Ezra. And if both of them have influence on the objective and a text that's maybe a little bit better than this text, and just units that are, or maybe cards in here that function better with what the rest of the deck's trying to do. Maybe still give me a resource, still give me a fairly big main, but maybe give me a different fake card, right? Like maybe give me a different chud, a chud that synergizes better. Then that can work. But again, this pod's still fine. 8 pips, it doesn't kill you on edge. It's pretty solid there. Blast is always nice. And again, the consistency is really what you're looking at when you're playing Zeb. And if you want more upside, you can always take these pods out. You throw Gamble Run back in, and you throw Owen and or Watcher's Obi back in, and the deck can function that way as well. So if anyone wants to play it, I highly recommend it. It's loads of fun. And it does take a little bit of time to learn. You have to kind of learn what you want in your opening hands. You can't be afraid to discard cards ever. Like you just don't want to be holding on to stuff. I mean, that's why you have Undercover. Undercover lets you get all your good stuff back. And then also you got to be careful with how you attack. This deck actually concedes edge quite a bit. It only wants to win maybe 1 or 2 edge battles in the entire game. Most of the time, you're looking to trick your opponents into defending the wrong way and then bamboozling them, or defending the wrong way and then you surprise rescue mission a guy into play, or surprise Yoda into play with Yoda. You seek Yoda, and just not let them know entirely what you're trying to do until you do it. The last thing I feel like I should point out with this deck is how does it perform against Scum? And the answer is it doesn't really matter. The only Scum card that really hurts this deck is the Slaver, which people don't really play too often. Although I did notice one problem with this deck when it comes to Scum, and it's with a Scum card that's not released yet, and it's with Dr. Evazan. Now this doesn't happen too often when I've tested it, and I've tested it several times, but if an opponent can hit like an early Caesar with an early Evazan, and let's assume that neither one of them get killed, that's a real problem, because if you blank Caesar to blank the Falcon, you kind of cut off a huge stream of combos, because a lot of this deck wants to just get discounted Falcon in there, and it wants to use the Falcon as a way to be able to make an attack, force out, either let it go in unopposed or force a block from your opponent, and after they commit, you let them do what they're going to do. Then once they've burned all their tactics, you bounce them and then play your real threat. Being able to just blank that, take away the Falcon's edge, take away his ability to bounce, and do it at action speed, right? Because Tarkin can't blank the Falcon if Falcon comes in during conflict, but Dr. Evazan can. That's a problem. And again, it doesn't happen all the time. It's kind of hard to get those two on the table and then still not let them die for whatever reason. Like maybe you lose an edge battle, or maybe they just die because I have too many guns against them. So it's not like it happens all the time, but it does happen like 1 out of every like 5 or 6 games or something, and then that's terrible. But yeah, this is the deck. This is like my special baby of a deck. I've been working on this for a little while, and if you want to try it out, be my guest. It's loads of fun to play, but again, it takes practice to be sure. I would expect that the first 2 to 3 times you play this deck, it's probably going to be underwhelming, but the more and more that it gets played, the more you see the little tricks. And also, I mean, the more you play it, the more you see little flaws that come up with it too, like I've seen. But who knows? Maybe I run this at Worlds, or maybe I just run, your classic Gamor Jedi. This has been Holding All the Cards. Until next time.